you should be able to hear and see me, but if any of you can let me know in the chat that you can hear and see me, just to have confirmation of that, that would be great. Okay, great. Yep, I can see loads of you are confirming that. That's brilliant. Okay, so welcome to the latest of our ScHARR mini masterclasses. This week we are joined by, just waiting for my next slide to load, Dr. Emma Hock, who's going to be talking about the everyday things that shape our actions, the influence of the environment on health behaviour. Before we start, I'm just going to go through a few little practical things about how to kind of interact during the webinar. I can see that obviously lots of you have already gotten your head around the chat functionality, but there's a few other things that you just need to be aware of in terms of how to interact. So I'll quickly share that with you now. So right now you should be able to see a little slide that's just explaining some of the things that are around the screen for those of you that haven't used Blackboard Collaborate before. So in terms of the chat functionality, and that's kind of the thing that we'll probably be using today, to access that you click the little purple tab in the bottom right hand corner. Then a sort of sidebar, a white sidebar will slide out, and the speech bubble button at the bottom of that will open up the chat, and then you'll see there's a box at the bottom and you can just type anything you want in and press enter. So in terms of how we're going to run the webinar today, Emma's going to deliver her session. It's okay to post questions during the session, but we'll come to those questions at the end, and obviously you can ask further questions at the end, and usually the easiest way to do that is by typing them into the chat box. If you do want to use your microphone, then at the bottom of your screen you can see three little icons. The first one, which should show your microphone with a line through it at the moment probably, if you click on that, enable your microphone and you'd be able to speak to us. Similarly, the one in the middle for video. And if you're having any kind of issues and you want to get our attention for some reason, particularly if perhaps you're having a technical problem and you like our learning technologist Dan or Luke to help you out, if you hit the raise hand, we'll get back to you via the chat and see what's going on and see if there's anything we can do to help you. So that's just a little bit about Blackboard Collaborate. Session is being recorded today so that we can share it with you afterwards. It's not going to be sort of shared outside of the group of people that are here today, but just obviously some of you might need to leave early. Sometimes people aren't able to stay for the whole session, so by recording it, then you're able to look at the rest of it later on when you've got the time. So I'm just going to switch back to my previous slide. So today, Emma, like I say, is going to be talking about the influence of the environment on health behaviour. I've known Emma for over a decade now, I think, or the best part of a decade. And I think Emma hasn't worked for ScHARR quite as long as I have. I've been there for 17 years now, I think. But she's getting close to that. She's someone who's been at ScHARR for a long time. Emma did a PhD in Sheffield in 2007, and that was a project that looked at physical activity and smoking abstinence. When she came to ScHARR, she came as a systematic reviewer in public health, and she's currently part of the ScHARR TAG. TAG stands for Technology Assessment Group. So there's multiple technology assessment groups in universities around the UK, and University of Sheffield ScHARR hosts one of those. So Emma's a systematic reviewer that's part of that group, and they conduct technology assessments, health technology assessments, on behalf of NICE, the National Institute for Excellence in Health and Social Care in the UK. She has an interest in health behaviour change, and as part of her teaching role within ScHARR, she leads a module on contemporary health psychology and behaviour change, and that's as part of our Masters in Public Health programme, which is our biggest main postgraduate talk programme that we run both on and offline as part of our PGT offering at ScHARR. So, like I say, if you want to ask questions, you can post them in the chat box at any point during the webinar, but we will come to the questions and respond to them at the end. Like I say, it's fine to post questions at the end of the session as well. If you want to ask your question in person, you can switch your microphone on to do that, but again, please do that at the end of the session. So I'll just switch over the slides Emma's, and then I'll be able to hand over to her.
Great. Thank you very much, Claire, for the introduction. Can I just check? Can people hear what I'm saying?
We can.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so it's impossible to be influenced by the things that are around us. Everything has to be organised in a certain way, and that's going to inevitably have an impact on what we do, whether it's consciously or not. So we're going to talk about some of the things, the ways in which that can happen, just quite quickly in this seminar, because obviously it's quite a large and complex area. So I'm going to touch upon some of the key concepts, some examples, and some research that's been done in this area. So how has this all come about? Well, over the past couple of 100 years or so, our lives have changed quite drastically. So we've gone from being people who, for millions and millions of years, had to do a lot of activity to get a small amount of food, to being people who basically can go around not having to move very much and being able to access food. So this is in the case of transport and at work and in the home in terms of housework. The changes that have happened brought about by the Industrial Revolution, the Cyber Revolution, have been unprecedented in the history of humans. And so it's obviously easier to access food, in particular food that's quite high energy dense. By that I mean food that's generally quite high in fats and sugar, which humans have generally found quite scarce in the past. So we're faced with a situation now where this has led to problems in terms of people's health. And research in this area actually started in the 1950s, and one of the seminal studies was by a researcher called Morris and colleagues, who actually looked at the impact of bus conductors and bus drivers' jobs on cardiac outcomes. And they found that, as you might expect, bus conductors had far fewer negative cardiac outcomes than bus drivers, who were largely sedentary. So this kind of kick-started interest in this area in terms of looking at the effects of our lifestyle on non-communicable diseases. Now, there's been numerous efforts in terms of research and programs to try and change behaviour, to try and actually get people to change what they do. And this has come in various different forms. It's sort of more formal interventions where people can sign up for something, like maybe sign up for an exercise program, or sign up for Weight Watchers or Slimming World, or sign up for something that gets people to do various different things to make changes to their own lifestyles, to try and mitigate the effects of some of these changes that we've had in the last 100 years or so. But there might be some issues with that. I mean, like I say, these programs are, I'm not saying they're rubbish, they're not at all. There are some successes with programs that get people to change individual behaviours. However, they tend to mostly benefit people who are sort of at the higher end of the socio-economic spectrum. So I guess people who are less poor and more wealthy. And these changes can be difficult to sustain. Once someone's made an individual change, you're really looking at changing someone's habits completely. Otherwise, there's a risk that people might then go back to doing what they're doing. Obviously, individual programs can't reach everyone, and perhaps wouldn't even want to reach everyone. So really, it's difficult to do something like this at a population level if you're thinking about kind of reversing all the changes that have happened through the course of the Industrial Revolution, in terms of the impact on our health. And part of the problem is that people are still living in the same conditions. So we're still living in the same environment, moving around the same environment, and interacting with the same things, and we're just being asked to change the way we interact with them. So perhaps as an alternative, which might be to change some of the features of the environment to make some of those choices a bit easier to make. So there are various ways that we can do this. We can alter the properties of objects or features of the environment. We can alter the placement of objects, or we can do both of these things. So I'll just briefly talk through some examples of strategies that have been used. So we could alter the ambient environment in terms of the music lighting, for example, to make people think and move differently. For example, there's I think quite a bit of research in retail which suggests that people move faster and faster music is played. We can actually design or adapt some of the things that are around us. So, for example, in some offices, they've been implementing desks that can be set either just to stand at or to be altered between sitting and standing. In some places, there was a study done where a supermarket actually put a specific section in their supermarket trolley for adding fruit and veg. It was labelled fruit and veg, and I think they found that people were more likely to buy fruit and veg when they took one of these trolleys. And another common thing that you might have come across is actually changing the serving size. And this has been looked at in some research, so that how the size of, for example, a glass can affect how much we drink out of it. And also we can use labelling to actually give some messages about the product. So, for example, you've seen the traffic light labelling, which has come in on food products, indicating information about their nutritional status. So this can impact on people's behaviour and the way they interact with the thing, and also perhaps health warnings on cigarettes. There's another example of that. So we can also change the size or quantity of a product. So one measure which people will have noticed, I think the classic example is always wagon wheels, isn't it? Wagon wheels are smaller than they used to be. It's to change the size of products, so crisps, chocolate bars. The size has gone down of some of those. And the idea is that because people perceive the size of a packet of something as being a portion of that thing, that they would then eat less if the portion was smaller. And that's a subconscious thing. We can alter the placement of objects. So we can actually make certain things more available. So things, for example, healthy foods that you want people to eat, fruit and vegetables. If there are more options on offer, then it's more likely that people are going to take these. And likewise, if there's more options on the menu, then there'll be more availability of the thing. And the classic example, I guess, is a fruit bowl. So I guess we do that intervention ourselves in our homes. We place a fruit bowl on the table, and it immediately increases the availability of fruit. So another option is making it easier to do the thing that's healthier or perceived to be healthier, and make it more difficult to do the thing that's less healthy. So this is to do with I guess the design of all sorts of features. So the design of buildings, for example, I think we can all think of buildings where you walk into the lobby and straight away you've got lifts and you've no idea where the stairs are. And so it's possible to address that by changing the design of buildings to make the stairs the prominent feature. And there's some research findings to suggest people are more likely to use the stairs. Similarly, at the checkouts of supermarkets and even smaller shops, you can see quite often there are chocolate bars, sweets, and so on. And some places have actually changed the arrangement of this to put fruit at the checkouts instead. And similarly, in terms of cigarettes, it's become more difficult to see them and to access them because they're all behind the counter and they're all shut. And in fact, another way to do this is the way that items are ordered on a menu. So there's actually a study conducted last year in McDonald's where they changed the items on the drinks menu so that Coke Zero, which was listed third, was moved to the top of the menu and listed first, as you can see in this small picture here. And they moved Coca-Cola with the sugar in from the top of the menu right down to the bottom, and that actually decreased sales of Coca-Cola and increased sales of Coke Zero. So just these few small changes are some of the things that can be done, and they seem to have an effect on people's behaviour. The third option is to alter both the properties of something and how it's placed in relation to other things. And there's a couple of ways this can be done. So we can use priming, just using the way that cues are placed in the environment to make people do something without even thinking about it. So I guess a classic example is that if there's an ashtray on the table, people think it must be a smoking area, and they can smoke there if they do smoke. There's also prompting, which is usually that where you present signs or information about particular to help people divert towards that thing. So the classic example is using signs at the point of choice between the lift and the stairs, or the stairs and the escalator, which prompt people to use the stairs. And actually, there's a research team in Birmingham, I think, which did quite a lot of research into that, and they looked at the effects of all sorts of different messages, such as the amount of times you need to climb the stairs to climb Mount Everest and things like that, or the amount of energy that's burned with climbing the stairs a certain number of times. And they found that these signs did actually help people to choose the stairs more often. Another technique is people might be putting markings on the floor, which we're quite used to at the moment, which is just sort of maybe footprints leading to the stairs or arrows leading to the stairs. And I think in the absence of other direction, if people are not really thinking about this fully, then they might follow the footprints or the arrows subconsciously. So there's kind of a range of techniques there that could be used. How effective are they? Well, there are some systematic reviews in this area. So I'm aware we've got quite a varied audience. For those who don't know, a systematic review is a way of looking at all the primary studies, the evidence that there is on something, and making an overall finding from it, aggregating all the findings and seeing what the evidence says overall. And generally, the evidence is fairly weak. The studies are not that great. Most studies are lab-based, single experiments, and many studies use methods that aren't that reliable. But there is some evidence to suggest that these kinds of techniques can have an effect on people's eating behaviours, including choosing fruit and vegetables over other options, and also their eating behaviours in settings such as school dining room, if the ordering of the items is changed. And also physical activity, just changing how people move and how much people move, and stair use seems to be the main one. So in places like shopping malls, train stations, universities, researchers have consistently found that where people are directed towards stair use, then people will tend to use the stairs a bit more. But like I said, one of the main problems is that we don't know how long these effects last for. So we actually need now some more robust evidence and some more studies. So generally it's been easier to actually investigate these things in a laboratory, so where you would have quite controlled conditions, and you would get people to come in and then ask them to choose from a range of options, and you'd rearrange the options accordingly. So there's a few examples of this that I'll give to you. So first of all, we've got this buffet study where the researchers got male undergraduates and asked them to choose from items at a buffet. And there were two different buffets. The control buffet was, I guess, what's perceived to be the normal standard buffet that you might get. And you'd start at the end that says plates at the right hand end, and then move along the buffet. So you've got the pasta, the bread, the meatballs, and so on. And then you've got the salad. And then they changed things around a bit and put the salad first, and they wanted to see how this impacted on people's choice of food. What they found was that people who had the salad first actually served themselves more fruit and vegetables, and they measured the energy intake of people who had both buffets and found that they had a lower calorie meal if they had the salad first as well. But like I said, that's in a lab. It's under very controlled conditions. We don't know how this will play out in real life. Another wonderful example of this is our colleague in ScHARR, Inge Kiersbergen, who's done some research on alcohol serving size. So what she and her colleagues did was they invited people into the laboratory and served them with some alcoholic drinks in pairs, the people were, and they were randomly chosen to receive either a standard serving size or a slightly smaller one. And this was wine, beer, and cider. And what they found was that when people had smaller glasses, they drank a bit less in terms of the amount of units of alcohol. And they did actually replicate this study in a bar as well. So they did this first and then took it into a real life setting. Okay, so another example of lab-based research, which is really interesting, is that these researchers actually looked at the shape of a glass. So the glasses were the same size, but when the glass was a different shape, people drank differently. So in the example on the right, the wine glasses, these were all soft drinks, I should add. These weren't alcoholic drinks. But what they found was that that those who drank out of a champagne flute, the straight-sided glass, actually drank less than those who drank out of the outward sloping glasses, the cocktail glass. And then amongst the tumblers on the left-hand side, what the research was that those who had a straight-sided glass drank quite steadily, whereas those who had an outward sloping glass actually drank more to begin with, which when it comes to I don't know, orange juice, it probably won't make much of a difference. But if this was an alcoholic drink, what you probably find is that people get drunk a bit more quickly. So how do these kinds of findings translate to the real world? Well, there have been people who've done studies in the field and looked at the effects of these types of small environmental changes. So, for example, there was some research done at a train station kiosk, which is obviously a very interesting setting because people are usually rushing through quite quickly on the way to catching a train. And so if an item is readily available, they might be more likely to choose it, we would imagine. And so these researchers started off by spending 4 weeks looking at people's purchasing habits of food items under normal arrangements that the kiosk had. And then what they did was, after 4 weeks, they rearranged everything for another 4 weeks so that the healthier items were placed at the checkout displays. And what they found is that more of those healthier products were actually sold during those 4 weeks. So it's quite an interesting example. Where's my slide? Okay, so another study looked at the use of sit-to-stand desks in a government organisation. And the default position for sit-to-stand desks was sitting. And what they did was they spent 2 weeks changing these to a default setting of standing. So the desks would be set to standing, and then people had to change them to sitting if they wanted to sit down at them. And what they found was, quite interestingly, they looked at some of the longer term effects. They didn't just examine this over the intervention period. So whilst the standing desks were set to standing, people actually stood up to work a lot more. This increased quite dramatically. And the effects seemed to persist. A few people were still, at the end of 2 months, quite a few more people were still standing at the desks, although it was less than actually during the intervention. So there is some suggestion that these effects can persist even when the technique has been stopped. Now, in terms of how this pans out at a population level, I think it's really interesting that someone's done a study actually changing the environment permanently, and seeing how this affects people living in those areas. So this was a study where there were improvements made to walking in areas in 3 localities, in Cardiff, Kenilworth and Southampton. And they did a questionnaire to assess people's walking and cycling before and after, and they looked at 2 years afterwards. And they found that those who lived near the routes actually walked and cycled more, and this was able to be explained by people's perceptions of how walkable and cyclable the environment was, and by their use of these routes. So that, I think, is quite an interesting example of how these things can play out, I suppose, in the real world, sort of over the longer term. And in some cases it doesn't work. So in this case, there was 2 office buildings in Norway, and what they did was they tried to increase people's use of the stairs over the lifts, and they actually monitored, they counted how many people used the stairs and the lifts before and after this intervention. So what they did was for 5 weeks, I think it was, they put some footprints leading to the stairs, and then 4 weeks after that, they put stair rise banners on as well, so sort of banners on the stair rises with information, trying to encourage people to use the stairs. And they found that stair use actually decreased when this intervention was in place. So, which is, I think, really interesting, because it shows that it doesn't always work. And the authors actually said they thought this was because stair use was actually quite high already. And in fact, at the control site where there weren't any interventions, the stair use was extremely high. So I guess if they bothered to monitor that beforehand, then they would have seen that perhaps there wasn't any need to have an intervention in this particular context. So it just goes to show that we have to kind of think about what kind of changes we can make to actually make a difference. Now, at the moment, you might recognise some of these techniques being used to help stop the spread of COVID-19. So we've got interventions such as floor markings, I guess sort of almost subconscious prompting us to maintain distance from other people, especially in indoor settings such as shops. And you've also got other interventions such as increasing the availability of face masks. I mean, I think right at the very start of face masks being mandatory on public transport, there were people handing them out. And also they've been made much more available in shops. So you can see these kind of interventions happening all the time. I should add that this approach is not without its problems. Obviously, there are some issues with using small environmental changes. One of the issues is that there might be an ethical problem with this. You know, is it really ethical to be changing the environment to try and control people's behaviour? Is it manipulation? Can we really be sure that it's justified? Another issue is that there's an assumption that one size fits all. So one change of the environment will address everyone's issues. And as we know, people are highly complex. We know that individualised approaches tend to work well. So it is a fairly blunt approach. At the population level, it may not work for every individual. Another criticism of this type of approach is that it doesn't address the other reasons behind people's behaviour. It's quite crude in that sense. It makes the assumption that people are doing something because of the way the environment's set up, and there might be other motivations behind it. So, for example, someone may not be using the stairs because they've got a medical condition that prevents them from using the stairs. Maybe they've got an artificial hip or something like that, so they really would like to but can't. And I guess this sort of thing might impact on them negatively, whereas there could be other things they could do that don't. And in fact, these types of changes can often creep into other interventions, or as part of other much wider theoretical models such as the behaviour change wheel. There is also the suggestion that making the changes to the environment might take away someone's sense of achievement if they really want to change their own behaviour, and maybe it takes a bit of ownership away from them if the desserts are moved somewhere else, rather than them having to feel like they've done really well in not choosing to have one. So there is that argument to be made as well. Also, it can be problematic to make these changes when we're not really clear about what it is that's healthy. So I guess you could make this argument about some nutritional approaches where there might be a grey area as to what the optimal diet is, and again that might vary by person. So I think there are some more clear-cut areas where we definitely know it's healthier and better for the environment to take the stairs rather than use the lift. And I think it's helpful to have people eating fruit and vegetables rather than a chocolate bar, but there might be other changes that you're nudging people towards that may not be that healthy. Like, for example, choosing Coke Zero on a menu, it contains a higher amount of artificial sweeteners, and I think the jury seems to be out as to how healthy they are for you. So you still probably couldn't call that a healthy option. So it's a very complex area, and I wanted to kind of highlight that. But there was also the argument, if it's not ethical to change people's behaviour and sort of nudge them in the direction of something healthier, what about the changes that are already happening? So we know that industry spends a lot of money and effort on actually implementing these strategies to get people to buy more of certain things. And quite often, these things are things that have negative consequences on health. So I think in the retail sector, a lot of thought goes into how products are presented in shops. For example, the alcohol industry quite often pays for displays that are very prominent. So if you walk into a supermarket during the World Cup, for example, you'll see probably a great big stack of multi-packs of beer right in the in the storefront. So that's kind of an environmental change intervention that's been implemented by industry, designed to make people buy and presumably drink more beer, but it's actually not in their health interests to do that. Also, there is the consideration that sometimes things are a certain way, so that the stairs have to be somewhere, the lifts have to be somewhere. Why not design the building so it's easier to use the stairs if there really is nothing in it and there's no other reason not to? So there are these arguments as well. So to conclude, I'll wrap it up because I can see there's quite a lot of questions. It's a complex field. It can be useful to do some of these things to alter the properties of the environment and objects, which can make it easier for people to choose a healthier option, perhaps try and counteract some of these changes that have been happening to our environment over the past 100 years or so, which have made it more difficult. Also, we're aware that industry uses these kinds of techniques to affect us, and it is possible to counteract these to some extent. But obviously there are some caveats, big caveats. So we saw the block in Norway. If people are already doing the thing you want them to do, there's absolutely no need to intervene. We need to be aware that one size doesn't fit all. It's possible that some interventions like this at population level will work better for some people than for others. It's best to do this where there really is a clear consensus over what is healthy. I guess we have to be very, very aware that we're kind of steering people towards things when we think it's the healthiest choice, but it might not be. And obviously there's the issue of power. So who's deciding, what the placement of these things is? And perhaps a way around this, and some of the ethical objections might be to work with the people concerned to, I guess, make them aware that at the moment the environment's set out to make them choose certain things, and is there something they want to do to change it, and perhaps co-produce an engine. And also, I guess we can be aware that this might help, but it's not the full story. It might be part of a helpful approach. Okay, so I was going to move on to questions.
Okay, thanks, Emma.
Yep.
So what I'll do is I'll just read through and select a few questions that we've got time for, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So the first question that we had was from Richard, and he asks, how could you investigate environmental influence in real world settings where experiments are not possible?
Yeah, that's it. It gets really messy because obviously the reason that a lot of these things were investigated in the lab is because it's very easy to control everything, whereas in the real world you can't. So you can say that more people use the stairs and the lifts, and you can imagine it might be because you made it easy to use the stairs, but yeah, there's lots of other things that impact on this, so it gets more and more difficult. So I guess you can do observational research, but you've got the caveat that you're not controlling everything.
Okay. The next question was from Abby, she's had to leave early, but she said that she'd like to ask a question because I think she'll watch the recording. So she says, where do you think responsibility lies for creating a healthier population? Should this be at government level, or do we require more education of the general public?
Yeah, that's a really interesting issue, actually, because I think whoever does it, everyone has some sort of ulterior motive. So I think generally the government will try and implement things that help people to prevent them getting ill in cases where there's less money to spend on illness, so perhaps in a recession. And we know this because all of the research on behaviour change came about during, I guess it sort of started in the 1970s in the recession that was then, to try and focus people on being more healthy and spending less money on healthcare. So everyone has an agenda. That's the problem. So you can educate people, but then if you're educating them, you're coming from a certain position as well. So I think anything that empowers people, I guess, is a better approach. But you just have to be aware of people's agendas and assumptions, I think.
Okay, a question from Albert. Do you think the most important constructs for changing health behaviour is an interplay of the health belief model and access, availability and affordability of risk and protective factors of disease? It's quite a complex question.
That is a really complex question. So the health model is quite an old-fashioned model of behaviour change, which considers, I guess, people's own individual thoughts and beliefs about doing an action and the effect that might have. And yeah, access and availability will have an impact, and affordability is important as well. One thing I didn't mention was inequalities, and I guess you're kind of hinting at that, just because I wanted to keep this quite concise. But basically, I think it's important to look at inequalities because we know that a lot of interventions that are designed based on things like the health belief model can actually adversely impact on inequalities. So they can make it less likely that the people, say, with lower socioeconomic status who probably would most benefit from an intervention will actually get it and will actually manage to achieve the desired health state. So I think there's other factors that are important too, Albert, which are, I guess, the cultural context and the social context. So in some places, in some areas, it might not only be much more difficult to do, say, physical activity because it might not be as safe, for example, to go out for a walk, but also it might be less socially acceptable because if someone sees you jogging, then you might stand out as being the only one who's doing that, and other people might have a negative reaction towards you. So there's lots of really complex factors at play. It's not that the case of certain things are most important. There's all sorts of different things, I think.
Okay, there's a question from Tim who says, regarding the ethical issues of changing the environment, isn't it also the case that it's unethical not to change the environment if the current environment is a cause of ill health?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, so in some ways you've got an obligation to do that. This is very topical at the moment, where the current environment can be a cause of immediate ill health. And I guess this is the COVID-19 crisis is bringing everything into quite sharp relief. But yes, if that is a good point. And with things like physical activity and the placement of stairs or the placement of fruit at checkouts and things, it's so subtle that I don't think people or organisations or governments feel like it's unethical not to change that. But perhaps we need to raise awareness and make that the case, because I agree, it is unethical.
Okay, a question from Lily. Do you think that the root cause and solution is empowering people to make their own decisions? People may feel these interventions are patronising. There might be other underlying issues why they choose long-term, less healthy options.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right there. I think that's a really good point. And I think that's why I brought in the caveats, because I think anything like this has to be implemented very carefully and with full awareness of power relations. And I think quite often that's not always the case. But I always think that quite often in industry and situations like that, they're definitely not thinking about people being in charge. They're wanting to make decisions for us about what we should buy, and that's not always in people's best interest either. So that's why I kind of suggested right at the end that that a way to do this in a more empowering way would be to make people aware of how their environments may be potentially setting them up to do certain things, and then seeing what they want to do about it and what they think might help. But I think you're absolutely right. I think empowerment is very important, but also I think realizing that freedom of choice is a bit more of an illusion than I guess we might ordinarily think might be part of that.
Okay, and then I think one last question from Phillips. It's quite specific, but obviously given your interest in smoking cessation, I think it's a very relevant one for you. Do you think government should put more pressure to curtail cigar smoking, considering the danger it poses to the health of people?
Okay, well, that's interesting, because I imagine cigar smoking isn't something that's done, I suppose, on a wide scale in public. It might be done in certain circumstances and in certain circles. I guess if you could put a bit more detail about the cigar smoking, that would be useful, because I know that cigars I think they contain about the same amount of tar as 5 cigarettes, so they are quite potent and quite strong. I would imagine they contain, obviously, passive smoking of cigars would be a health risk. But I would have thought that the cigarette smoking measure would also apply to cigars. So I'd be interested to know a bit more about that, if you can put some more details, please.
I think something that I'd sort of certainly noticed with having sort of an interest in health promotion is that smoking cessation campaigns and health promotion do seem to be almost exclusively focused on cigarette smoking. And although obviously cigars and other sort of tobacco products are still subject to the same, plain packaging, and they're still part of the smoking ban and so on and so forth, I think perhaps the message about cigar smoking sometimes isn't quite as strong, you know what I mean, in terms of, I think with health promotion, sort of particularly TV campaigns and things like that, cigarette smoking has really been portrayed as unattractive. And I think cigar smoking in particular has always had a certain image around it. And perhaps some of the campaigns perhaps don't sort of, because it's a niche area, I suppose, within smoking, the far bigger problem is cigarettes. But I can see maybe that there's perhaps an issue that cigar smoking and pipe smoking doesn't really get as much attention in terms of sort of the key messages around smoking. So perhaps that does enable some people to sort of maintain a belief that somehow cigars are different.
Yeah, you're right, Claire. And a couple of more people have just commented. Yeah, so yeah, typically tobacco control has focused on cigarettes, but I think there is an awareness that there is other types of tobacco products. Like, I'm glad you mentioned shisha, because that's also an issue. And again, yeah, I think you're right. Some of the message on cigarette smoking probably wouldn't be thought by people who use that type of tobacco to apply to them. As I say, this is a little outside the scope of this webinar, but I know that some smoking tobacco control teams are actually dealing with different types of smoking specifically. And I think shisha is one of those areas where they're actually working with people to produce messages that help people to, I guess, realise that shisha smoking might be harmful, and to try and curtail the practice. But cigar smoking, yeah, it's seen as high status. So yeah, that's a good point. Let me go back to the question again. Yeah, so I guess some specialist messages would need to be designed that particularly affected people. But at one time, cigarette smoking was seen as fairly high status, and that sort of changed. So it's about a culture change, I think.
Okay, thanks for that, Emma. Okay, I think we've pretty much come to the end of the time we've got for today. Sorry, Tim, I can see you've got to head off for your next meeting. Thank you for coming. But thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll make the recording available to you afterwards. So for those of you that had to, sorry, Anna, I can see you just mentioned about vaping. I'm not sure what you wanted to ask about vaping. We probably have just about got time if you can type in the question more specifically.
Yeah, we are doing a clinical trial on vaping, how much it has got an effect on cardiovascular outcome. And we have seen that even the vaping with and without nicotine has got a lot of difference compared to the nicotine replacement therapy. And we have seen quite beneficial outcome in cardiovascular when we are talking about the without nicotine electronic cigarette, because we have seen that over a period of time, last 3 years or so, when GP and other people have subscribing electronic cigarettes, the younger generation is considering is a very safe cigarette. And we have seen 2 million youngsters have joined vaping program. Yeah, they have learned this thing through their parents, their peer group, that this is a safe cigarette, smoking that is safe. So it has got a, so definitely the nudging theory definitely has some direction that we have to how to control the supply factor, or how best we can educate the younger generation, because 2 million cases, if you account include in the smoking prevalence rate, we are going back to almost 30 years ago. So 1972 prevalence rate was almost around 38-40%. So we are going back if we include vaping and smoking together.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the sort of the very rapid popularity of vaping, particularly among young people. And yeah, as you say, the sort of perception that it's completely safe, whereas the reality is that we're only just beginning to develop a sort of sound, robust evidence base around vaping. And as it stands, we don't know for sure that vaping is safe. And indeed, obviously, some studies are suggesting that potentially it is a risk to health. So young people sort of en masse taking up vaping is a real concern in the longer term, because obviously we don't know what the longer term impacts on their health might be. So thanks for contributing that, and it's nice to hear from someone over their mic as well. Okay, I will wrap it up there because we're nearly at 2 o'clock. But thank you everyone so much for finding the time to join us today. I know these sessions are really popular with people who are working from home, but obviously it's still giving up your time to be with us. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. like I say, we'll send out the link to the recording later on. So for those of you that had to leave partway through, you'll be able to listen to that later on and obviously hear the second part of the presentation. But thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you that are still here, we have got more of these sessions coming up. So the next one that we have coming along is with Dr. Andrew Booth. His session is in December, I think. And his session is about a question of who, not if, achieving real impact through qualitative systematic reviews. And then the next one after that is with Dr. Colin Angus, who's going to be talking about visualising the COVID-19 pandemic. Colin has a Twitter account. He's at Victim of Maths. You can just about see on his slide there. He's called Victim of Maths. And if you're interested in learning a bit about his work around visualising COVID in advance, have a follow of his Twitter account, because he does post visualisations and shares them that way reasonably often. So by all means, sign up for the next two again through the @ScHARR Sheffield Twitter account that you can see on that slide. We promote all of these sessions and send out the links to join up. But thanks for joining us today. For those of you who are interested in any of our postgraduate courses, as I said, Emma teaches on our Masters in Public Health. At the URL you can see on the screen, there is a link to all of the information about the postgrad courses we run, both our campus courses and our online courses. And there's also a sort of good generic email address that you can use if you want to contact the teaching support unit in ScHARR, who can answer questions about pretty much any of our programs and about the process of applying to any of our programs. And for those of you that are interested in signing up for those upcoming webinars, I'll just post the links in the chat to sign up now. Okay, so those are both clickable links on the right-hand side if you want to book for Dr. Andrew Booth's session or Dr. Colin Angus's. But thanks for joining us today, everyone.